If you've clicked on this video, you probably have some questions, starting with, what am I doing making trees with a particle plugin? Or, what is xParticles? Let me answer that last one. xParticles is the best plugin for Cinema 4D. Hands down. It does so many useful things in so many fields in 3D. But like the name states, it's a particle solver. It allows you to generate millions of particles and control them in a variety of ways. If you're an After Effects person, think of it as the trapcode particular of Cinema 4D. But the fun does not stop there. It also does explosions, fluids, volumes, forces, and other cool things like particle dynamics. This video is not sponsored, by the way, but what makes it the best plugin for Cinema 4D is that Insidium, the company that created xParticles, updates it all the time and has created this ecosystem where all these pieces work together seamlessly. And that's one of the reasons why today we're using it to make trees. All right, enough jibber jabber. Let's look at what we're going to be creating today. Okay, so we're in Cinema 4D. Now I'm using R20. If you're using R21 or another version in the future, some things might look slightly different or be in a slightly different place. If it is, try using the commander, which is this little magnifying glass thing in the corner, or you could press the hotkey Shift-C, and you can type in pretty much anything and it'll pop up here. So I could say, for instance, bevel. Now I could get the bevel deformer or the bevel modeling tool, or I could say XP turbulence. Boom. It'll add it right into my scene if I hit return or enter. So I've got a blank, fresh new scene here, and the first thing I'm going to do is set up an xParticles emitter. So I'm going to go to xParticles, XP system, and here we have a default emitter. Now, just to clean things up for my sake, I'm going to remove the icon here, the Insidium xParticles icon, just to get it out of the way. And the first thing I'm going to do is go to my emitter, and I'm going to call it Tree Emitter. And I'm immediately going to rotate this 90 degrees. So if I hit play, you see all the particles are shooting in an upward direction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my tree emitter, emission, and I'm going to change the emission mode to shot. And I only want to shoot one particle. So let's hit play. There's the one particle. Now, if you're having trouble seeing them, I'm going to go to display and change my editor display to spheres. Hit play. There we go. I got a sphere. So now that we have our emitter, let's go to generators, choose XP trail. And it's going to ask for an emitter here, so we can click on our tree emitter. It's now in this field. Now if I hit play again, you see we have a trail of our one particle. So up next, let's go to modifiers and choose generate modifiers, xpBranch. Now you can also go to xParticles, modifiers, generate xpBranch here, or use the commander. Now, this is the meat and potatoes of the whole process. Think of the first part as like the hors d'oeuvre course, like a small side salad or a cup of clam chowder. I should have eaten before I recorded this tutorial. In a nutshell, the branch modifier spawns new particles after a certain amount of time in a path much like a tree branch. Now, this effect has been used to create awesome, growing, organic effects that you've probably seen before. Today, we're going to use it quite literally to make branches. Let's dive in. There are two parts to the xpBranch modifier. There's the branch itself and its branching properties. Now, this is where it gets a little confusing. The branch itself
has controls such as how long it is, how often it bends over time, and how much of an angle it can bend and twist and turn itself. Then come its branching properties, and this is all about when it makes new branches. So we have how often it branches, how many branches at a time it should make when it spawns new ones. I'm trying not to say the word branches a million times, and I'm failing at it. What the total amount of branches it will try to make before the maximum length of the current branch is reached. And finally, what maximum angle the new branches can shoot out at the beginning.
Now this is where I think, oh gosh, I hope I just made sense, because that was a lot of crucial information. I'm going to leave a time code link in the description below that like button to that section, just in case you need to go back and reference it or hear it again, because that is very important.
So let's build our tree one branch at a time. Now the first thing I'm going to do actually is I'm going to increase how much time I have on my timeline. I have 90 frames by default with Cinema 4D. I'm going to actually choose 300. And I'm going to double click this bar to fill it up so I have the full 300 frame range. You'll see why in a second. So if I go to my xpBranch modifier, I'm in the General tab, and you see we have this max time, and it says 90 frames, as well as minimum time, 90 frames. If I go back to the beginning and press play, you'll see that once 90 frames occurs, our branch stops. And you also notice that it's instead of that straight path that we had before, it's starting to curve off. That's because of this bend deviation, the min and max bend deviation, which is 5 degrees, and we have the bend in 5 frames. So every 5 frames, at maximum, this branch itself is going to bend at about 5 degrees. So if I increase this bend deviation to, say, 30 degrees, and just for dramatic effect, I'm going to only make it 30 degrees, so it can only bend 30. There's no minimum, maximum variation. If I go to the beginning and hit play, you'll see it's just going crazy. So that's not really good for this particular branch that we're looking at. So let's bring it back to a maximum of 5 degrees. We'll hit play. We have this nice, simple, organic-looking curve. So, as I said before, this General tab is all about the branch itself. The branching settings, this other section, is all about when this branch decides to make new branches. So to do that, we're going to say add branch object. And you'll see that xparticles creates a new subbranch object right here. And I'm going to rename this subbranch main limbs. Now it's very important that you name these subbranches because it gets very complicated very quickly. And I'm going to go to my original xpBranch and I'm going to call it trunk. So when you clicked add branch object, it automatically selected this main limbs, which is a bit tricky because actually what you want to do is go back to this trunk object and click on the branching tab. Because if I hit play, you'll see I get a ton of brand new branches. And this doesn't look very much like a tree, or at least the one that we're going for. But you'll see it made this very interesting looking organic shape. But let's take a look at what these settings are. Branch in. Now branch in means every 5 frames, it's going to make new branches from this original first trunk branch that we made. So if I say branch in 30 frames, we hit play from the beginning, you see once we hit 30, boom, new branches are going to occur. So it really depends on how tall you want this tree to be and when you want its first main limbs to occur. So maybe let's try 40 frames. Go back, hit play. That's looking interesting. You also notice that these limbs are looking really long, and that's fine. We'll take care of that in a second. So let's look back at our settings. And I say number of branches. If I change this to 3, that means that when it branches in 40 frame increments, 3 branches are going to occur. So I hit play, boom, boom. So those 2 40 frame increments that fit within this original 90 frame length of how long this original trunk is going to occur, 2 times, each time 3 branches occur. So there's the first one, there's the second one. So not to get confused with this max branches value, where it's currently set to 1,000. That means that Within this maximum time in the general tab, we have 90 frames. We tell it to branch. Let's say we tell it to branch every 2 frames. And let's just say I name it 1. Now, it's going to try to make 1,000 branches within the length of this maximum time that it has. If I set this value to 1, and I say the number of branches that it can spawn is 1, and I tell it to branch every 2 frames, it's only going to make 1 extra branch, because in those 2 frames, it made 1 branch, and then it was done. Now, if I say that it branches every 2 frames, but it can make 5 total branches, hit play, it's going to make 5, because it reached the maximum. So, if I want a long trunk to occur, I think what I'm going to have happen is, maybe I'll have like 3 main limbs, and I want it to branch in about 40 frames. And I'll do one branch at a time, basically, with this number of branches, and I hit play. In that initial 90 frames, it was able to make, it's looking like 2 extra branches in its maximum 3 that it could have made. And you'll see we have those here. Let's see, maybe I'll have it branch 2 branches at a time. Reset, hit play. That's looking interesting. And I'm thinking that the angle for these new branches isn't wide enough. It's not spreading out enough. So let's go to this branch deviation, and instead of a minimum of nothing, let's increase it to 10. So it has to move at least 10 degrees from its initial branch point. That's looking okay. Let's rotate around a little bit. Let's try that maximum 30. And that's looking a bit better. That's giving us a little more of a shape to start with. I might just take it back to 1. This is where you really get to art direct how your tree looks. And we can throw some variation into when it branches, maybe by like, let's try 5. See if that changes the seed of how these branches are growing. And that actually looks a little bit better. That's more like what I'm looking for. Okay. We've got our trunk. We have it branching new branches. But we haven't really controlled what happens to these new branches. And that's when we move to the sub-branch object here. So this is where things start to get crazy. So now we're talking about the sub-branches properties, and that's what these object properties control. And these branching controls control when these sub-branches then decide to make new branches. So right now we're at the top properties on the main limbs, these supporting limbs. And I'm thinking they might be a tiny bit too long. So let's change this maximum length to, let's try 70. We can throw some variation in there. Let's say 60. They're not really bending enough for my taste. So I'm going to increase its minimum bend deviation so that they start moving around a little bit more. That's looking a bit interesting. Now we're going to add another branch object. And we're going to call this supporting limbs. Okay, now before we go crazy, I'm going to decrease the maximum length to something like 10 frames. Let's try that again. 10 frames, because I want to see what these new branches are doing. And again, you have to go back to the limb before and go to its branching properties to really control what's going on with these new limbs. When these main limbs are about to branch, we can say, I want it to branch in 10 frame increments let's do 2 branches at a time and a maximum of 7 branches total by the time it gets to here. Which it might get to because it's 70 frames long and we're branching every 10 frames. So let's see what happens. Hit play from the beginning. Okay, really interesting. So these branches aren't very long right now, but that's because I just wanted to see what this new sublim was going to do. Let's increase the length of this new sublim. Let's make it, I don't know, let's try 40 frames long. Hit play. Okay. So we're starting to build a structure here. I don't think these branches are bending out nearly enough. So I need to, again, go back to the branching properties and choose a larger minimum branch deviation. Hit play. A little bit better. Let's try 40 on the maximum. Getting there. Just gonna decrease that variation by making it 40 max, 40 min. That's looking a lot better. Now, in my supporting limbs, maybe I'll increase the bend and the variation of when they bend. Hit play again. Starting to get some really cool organic shapes. We can even try increasing the length. Excellent. And now we're going to add even more limbs. Let's say add branching object, and we're going to call these twigs. And we're going to go a bit crazy with this. We'll go back to our supporting limbs, and when it branches, we're going to say make 3 branches. Every 7 is a good increment for now. 7 frames. We'll vary it by 7 though. And they're going to be, yeah, so it's going to branch in these 60 frames. I'm going to go back to these twigs now and say that they are going to be 10 frames long. Wow, so look how quickly that became much more dense with those extra twigs. That's looking okay. Maybe we can vary how often these twigs bend. And now you can do this forever. And this is how you literally can make any tree you want. Right now we're going for some medium-sized tree. And it depends on how complicated you want this to make. I think for this demonstration, we're going to keep things a bit simple, but you can go crazy. Like I can make these twigs, if we say like 60 frames long, we can really vary up how this tree is looking. You might want something like that though. If you're looking for some stylized tree like that. Fascinating. Let's go back to 10 frames though. So looking at this now, if you have, looking at these branches and they all seem to be stemming out in a very similar direction, that should be the main limbs object. Now if we hit play, you're like, well, where are they? That's because you actually have to enable the supporting limbs because those are the actual objects that these main limbs are spawning. So let's go to the main limbs, and because we need to control its branching properties, I'm going to change its variation by like 2 and see if that changes the direction at all. And it very much did. Look at that. Now they're going in all sorts of directions. And if I add my twigs back on, let's see what that does. Excellent. So altering this variation in the branch in changes the seed of when it branches. And if you have something like, if we went back to 0 variation, you see that in this particular seed, most of these branches are going upward. And if that's what you're going for, that's great. But I want to add just a little extra variation. I'll put 2 back on. You'll see the difference. There we go. So if we hit render on this, you'll see nothing's appearing. That's because we still need to create the actual tree geometry. To do that, we're going to use the xpSpline mesher. If I go to generators and choose xpSpline mesher, you can also go to the xparticles menu, generators, xpSpline mesher. You'll notice that nothing happens. That's because we need to scroll down to where it says objects, and we need to take our trail and drag it in. Immediately, you'll see our tree has some low poly geometry along its splines. So if I hit render, there you go. If you're looking for some low poly tree geometry, you've got it. What's also cool is if I go back to the beginning and hit play, you can watch as your tree begins to grow out of nothing. Now you'll notice that my computer's getting much slower because it's creating all this geometry on the fly. I find that the best thing you could do is to turn the spline mesher off, go to the beginning, hit play, let it quickly create the splines because that's not very computationally intense, and then re-enable the spline mesher. And there you go. But if you wanted to render your tree growing from nothing, enable the spline mesher initially. Now the xpSpline mesher has some properties specifically for branching splines and geometry. If we look at it, we have sub-branch twists, scale, offset. So what's cool about this is I can decrease the sub-branch scale. And if you watch the tree, you'll see that as we sub-branch, each one gets slightly smaller. So if I zoom in here, you'll see that the sub-branches are looking a bit smaller than its preceding branch. Now, because these particles are getting a bit distracting, I'm going to go to my tree emitter, display. I'm going to take it back to dots. In order for that to update, I can say force display. There you go. Now we're just looking at the tree geometry. Now, it's looking a bit polygonal. So to fix that, let's increase our subdivisions. That's 1 subdivision. That's looking okay, but let's go a little higher. 2 subdivisions. Note that with every subdivision you add, it's going to take that much longer for your branches to generate their geometry. You also see all of these branches are a bit hollow. So let's add caps. There's a caps tick right here. And finally, what we can do, you see this scale graph? This is basically each branch from beginning to end, from left to right. And if we decrease the scale, our branches will get smaller as they get closer to the end. Now, despite them looking like weird little hands and fingers, we can change that too by going to this spacing value and decreasing it. Now we have some really interesting looking tree geometry. And remember, at any time, you can go back and say, if I want these twigs, so if I turn off the spline mesher, I get these twigs, and I say, you know what, those twigs aren't exactly long enough, let's make it 20 frames. We'll just go back to the beginning, hit play to regrow our tree. It grows out. Hit pause and just re-enable the spline mesher. That's looking really interesting. Now, you might notice at some point you get some really strange looking geometry like this one, where the spline mesher doesn't quite know what to do to fill this hole here. There's a couple things you can do. You can try increasing your subdivisions. Now, that didn't quite fix the issue, but you can actually change the overall size of the spline. Let's try 6. Immediately you'll see that hole is now cleaned up. But that also means now that you need to go back and adjust your sub-branch scaling. and probably your scale curve as well. This is looking fine. And now that I think about it, I think I want my twigs to be a bit smaller, because they're more like twigs, not like full branches. So I'm going to deactivate my spline mesher and hit play.
Coffee break.
Now, I know what you're thinking. Jeremy, that's great and all, but you're missing something rather important for a tree. Where are all the leaves? Well, I could say this is a winter tree tutorial and leave it at that, but because I like you, let's add some leaves into the mix. Now, the xpBranch modifier just keeps giving and giving. If we go to our initial trunk, that's the modifier itself for the xpBranch modifier, and we go to the spawning tab and we click Enable Spawning. It's going to ask for a spawning emitter. Since we don't have one, let's say create spawning emitter. You'll see in our emitters here in our XP system, we have a new emitter called XP emitter. Let's rename it leaf emitter. So I'm going to turn off my spline mesher because I want things to run a bit more smooth. But let's go back to the beginning and see what this does. Immediately you'll see that our initial branch, our first branch, which is our trunk, is spawning new particles. That's cool and all. And if you're looking for some kind of grow-on effect where there's sort of, a magical pixie creating a tree out of nothing, there you go. But what we really want to do is we want to go to our emitter and we want to turn the speed down to 0. So if we go to emission speed, let's just take it down to 0. Now if we hit play, you see that these particles are attaching to this main limb. Now if you can't see that, let's go to our display tab and we'll choose circle filled. And I always like to do this thing where I go into options and add screen space ambient occlusion. Let's hit play. Okay, so now we can see our particles. So this is cool and all, but what about these guys? Let's go back to our twigs and let's go down and enable spawning on this. If you enable spawning on this particular sub-branch, all of the supporting branches before that are going to spawn as well. So if we hit play, you'll see all the rest are spawning particles as well. So you don't need to enable it with any of the other limbs, just the furthest down limb that you want to have particle spawning. So this looks interesting, but we really don't want this main trunk to be spawning leaves. So how are we going to stop that? Well, we can keyframe. We've got a couple spawning properties here under the spawning tab in our xpBranch modifier. We have number to spawn and spawn interval. Now that means that every frame, every 0 frame, but every frame, the number to spawn is 10. If I crank it down to 1, hit play, you'll see that our particles are being spawned a lot further away from each other. If I set it to 0, none of them are going to spawn. So what we want to do is we want to keyframe this value to start spawning when the first branch starts to branch off. So luckily, we know in our branching tab that it's going to branch in 40 frames, give or take 5 frames. If I hit play, stop it right there, and I'm going to advance to... So at about frame 37, that's when we start branching off from our original base trunk. So if we go back to the beginning, we set a keyframe under spawning, and we say number to spawn is 0, keyframe. We go to frame 37, set it to 1, and add another keyframe. Go back, zoom out a little bit, hit play. There you go. We have no spawning particles on our main trunk, but it starts spawning after that. And now I think I actually want to move this just a little bit further away so that this part of the trunk doesn't have any particles. So let's just take this keyframe, left click, and drag it over a tiny bit, a couple more frames. Hit play. There we go. That's better. So if I wanted to view this in a render, nothing happens. And that's because X particles don't show up initially in the standard and physical renders. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Create, Shader, xParticles Material. And we're going to apply this we can name this anything we want. We could say xParticles leaves. And we'll drag this onto our leaf emitter. Now if I render, there you go. And also if I enable the spline mesher, hit render. There you go. Now I'll be honest with you, these don't really look like leaves. So in order to make this look a tiny bit more realistic, we need to create some. So let's make a quick and dirty leaf. I'm going to collapse my XP system for now, and I'm just going to turn it off. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a cube. And let's quickly just put together some geo that kind of resembles what a leaf looks like. Please, please take more care into making a leaf than what I'm about to do. So we have our leaf geo, and I'm going to bake this in as a single object. So I'm going to hit or right click and say connect and delete, and we're going to call this leaf. Now back to our tree. You'll see it's quite large, but that's not going to matter in a minute. In our system, we're going to pull out one more generator. So we're going to go in generators, and this one's actually called xpGenerator. And it's looking for an emitter to generate onto. We're going to choose our leaf emitter. We can drag it in here. There you go. And so what we need to do now is we need to take our leaf and we need to put it under the xpGenerator. Think of an xpGenerator like a cloner, in that everything you put underneath it, it's going to generate onto these particles. So let's see what happens. If we go back to the beginning, and I'm going to turn off my spline mesher again, and I hit play. Let's see what's happening. If I pause and zoom in, you can kind of see what's happening. Let's go back to our leaf emitter, display. Instead of circled fill, let's choose dots. And I'm going to hit play again. Look at that. Our leaves are getting spawned onto these particles. Now you'll notice something really strange is happening actually. And let me just double check my leaf emitter. Oh yeah, so our axis is actually in the center. So you'll notice our leaves are spawning in the center, and that doesn't look really natural, does it? So if I go back to my leaf, I think my axis moved when I converted it into its own object, when I combined it all together. If I go to leaf, click on axis, hit E, move this down to the stem, and now let's respawn these. Great. I'm going to pause it there. Now you can see that our leaves are spawning from the tip. But you'll see that they're all uniform. And that's not exactly the effect we're going for. So what we need to do is we need to go to our leaf emitter. We need to go to the Extended Data tab and say Use Rotation. And under the rotation mode, we're going to set it to tangential. There you go. The leaves are now spawning in the rotation of those particles. So much like the XP spline mesher, if I turn off the generator, and I'm thinking I'm going to want to hide this leaf, I'm just going to put this off to the side. It disappears when the generator's on, have all the splines create themselves, and then re-enable the generator. It's going to take a second because it's processing all of these instances of the geometry. Once it's done, you can see we've got quite a bit of leaves on our tree. And they're a bit small. I'm thinking an olive branch. So we'll go to the leaf emitter. Emission. Let's change the radius of these particles in our leaf emitter to something like 5. Again, we're going to take off the generator, regrow our tree, hit pause, enable the generator again. Immediately, our leaves look much bigger. So this will look a lot better if you take a bit more care in designing your leaf and in your tree geometry. But let's enable the spline mesher. Let's zoom out a little bit. Let's find a good angle here. And let's hit render. Now you'll notice this is going to take quite a long time for Cinema 4D to process all of these leaves. That's because there's so many instances of geometry that it needs to calculate. Oh, and you can also tell that our xParticles leaf emitter is trying to display each particle. So if I delete that shader off, hit play, regrow the tree, turn on the generator, then turn on the spline mesher, and render again, you'll see we have these neon green leaves. Now, the reason why they're neon green is because of the particle color. So if we go to the leaf emitter, and we go to display, and we look at the particle display and particle color, it's choosing this default green color. So you can choose a darker color, or you can have it take on the color or the shader that you have on your leaf geometry, or you could do something even more crazy, and you could say gradient random and choose which colors it can choose from a random gradient. And if we do that and regrow the tree by, again, taking all of these off, you'll see that our leaves now have these random colors, which is a really cool stylistic choice if that's what you're going for. Now, if you're using Cinema 4D's built-in standard or physical renderers, ta-da! You've got your tree and you're ready to go. You can merge your tree into one object and save it away for later use. However, this tree is packed with a lot of geometry objects. In fact, it's so dense that my viewport is having trouble keeping up. And this is with just a simple tree. We only have 4 branching objects if you include the xpBranch modifier called our trunk. To speed this up, we're going to take advantage of our GPU renderers such as Octane and Redshift. For this tutorial, I'm going to be using Redshift, but Octane has a very similar workflow when it comes to instancing geometry onto particles. So to get started, I'm going to deactivate the XP generator, and I'm going to add a Redshift tag by right-clicking, choosing Redshift and Redshift Object. I'm going to add an object tag to our leaf emitter. And if I go to the Particles tab, you'll see right now it's currently disabled. I can choose Custom Objects. Now this is very similar to what the XP generator was doing, where it was instancing multiple copies of this leaf geometry. But instead of doing this at the geometry level, we're actually going to do it at render time. And so it's basically like another version of a cloner. So if we take our leaf geometry and we drag it into here, into this bucket, we then go to Redshift Render View. And actually I'm going to go into my Redshift work custom layout that I have here just to make things simpler. And if I hit the play button to start off the render, it looks a bit strange. Now, I'll admit, when I first saw this, I thought this was really cool. So if you actually zoom out, you take a look at what we've got here. We've got this really cool looking sort of flower-like thing happening. I thought that was really awesome. Really funny mistake. But what's really happening here is the leaves are just way too big. So what we have to do is we have to go to the scale multiplier under our Redshift tag and just take this down to something like 0.012, I think is what I did. And I zoom in, and now we have, look how quickly this is going. I've got a much faster viewport, and I've got these leaves. And of course you can add multiple flavors of leaves in here. In this distribution mode, you can say sequential, as in to go first leaf, then the next object, then the next object, and just kind of do it like a cloner. Or you can choose random. Either way, and you can adjust the scale of these leaves. So like if I want to make them bigger, I can choose them like 3. But this basically instances the geometry using the GPU, so that you can free up the CPU and the rest of your memory so that you can work a lot faster. So there's a lot to do from this point forward. You can create a more realistic looking tree with different kinds of leaves, or you can add some bark, or you even notice that our tree at the bottom doesn't have any roots. So I implore you to go try to create a root system using a very similar technique that would be used for creating the branches. You can create an emitter, have it spawn from the bottom, and branch off and create a whole new root system. So you can make so many different kinds of trees with this technique, and I'm really excited to see if any of you use this to create your own trees. Please be sure to share what you're making, and I'd be happy to check it out.
Wow, there we have it. Trees with X particles. It's pretty amazing actually to think that you can use a tool like this that creates all these splines and these different networks and turn it into something completely different. So congratulations, you can now make any kind of tree you want. Now, I'm going to be making a follow-up video to this tutorial. It's something called Take It Further. And it's going to use these concepts, but it's going to sort of take it into a more advanced form. For instance, these trees don't have any textures on them. Also, the leaves are kind of a bit basic. But that's the cool thing about this technique is you can use it to do almost anything, any kind of tree you want. In fact, you can make blades of grass. You can make shrubberies. Shrubberies, if you will. I just wanted to say shrubberies. Who doesn't want to say shrubberies? Shrubberies. Did you say it with me? Shrubberies. All right, well, thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and if it was useful to you, please hit the like button, the thumbs up. It means so much to me. It also tells me that you guys are watching and that you really enjoy these kinds of videos. I have plenty more tutorials coming up soon. Hit the subscribe button and hit the bell if you want to be notified when I post new videos, which there will be quite a few coming out very soon that I've already got planned. So, thanks again. I'll see you in the next one.